All right, well, good evening. What is it? It's evening. Good evening and welcome, everybody. I'm Mark Nykirk, the director of the Scripps Howard Center for Civic Engagement, and welcome to the first lecture in this season's 6 at 6 lecture series. We're in our 10th year or 12th year, actually, of this series, which is designed to showcase research and scholarship by NKU faculty and students. So this is, by the way, our first hybrid event. Last year, we were totally virtual and broadcast from the Southgate Street School in Newport, which was a very significant school in our community. It's where the African-American children of Campbell County were educated for just over 80 years. And it's now a museum, and a museum that our students at NKU have worked on a good deal. Both our, not only our public history students, but I think a total of 10 different disciplines have worked at the school. And our theme last year was Black History and Culture. Our theme this year is the American Democracy. So stay with us through the season. And we're going to have a pretty fun and interesting year, which if I, let's see if I can, I promise you there'll be technical glitches, including one right now. So that's me. Here you can see the season. We're still working on finalizing some dates. It's been a little complicated this year as the COVID protocols have changed from time to time, and we're trying to get settled how things will work best. But we're going to have a variety of venues and delivery methods that I think will be engaging and be fun. We have a fairly substantial virtual audience tonight. So we welcome those of you who are joining us in that fashion. And for those of you who are virtual, we also have a live audience, and they're going to applaud enthusiastically, so that you something we missed last year in the virtual audience. So it's kind of fun to be back live and to experiment with the this hybrid methodology and see how that goes. So our office, the Scripps Howard Center for Civic Engagement, in a nutshell, we try to connect the campus to the community in a lot of different ways. We are very active in the service learning classes, connecting classes and aligned with their learning outcomes on projects in the community. I encourage you, if you have not seen it, to go, for example, by the flood wall in Newport, where there is a mural that celebrates the Southgate Street School that was born in a service learning class at NKU. There are about 100 to 150 of these classes in any academic year, and to the extent that we can, we will grow that list all of the time. This series is an example of that work of connecting the community and the campus. Our model for the first 10 years was to have this series at locations around Northern Kentucky and Cincinnati, and I'm sure we'll get back to that at some point, including a couple of times in the coming years. So welcome back to a live audience, and it's good to be with you, and I think we're going to have a engaging evening, and I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer Kinsley, who teaches in the Chase College of Law and is this evening's moderator. Jennifer.
Thanks so much, Mark. I echo your comments about how wonderful it is to be in this room together, and welcome also to those of you joining virtually as well. I'm so delighted to be with you tonight for this program entitled Perspectives on Populism, and we are in for such a treat. Tonight, we will hear from 3 distinguished faculty members, Dr. Jeffrey Williams, Dr. Philip Moberg, and Dr. Jonathan Cullick, leaving time at the end for your questions and comments. I will first introduce the panelists to you, and then I will invite them to individually speak for about 15 minutes each. For those of you in the live audience, please hold your questions until the end. For those of you participating virtually, please feel free to chat or include your questions in the Q&A feature, and I will submit them to the panelists at the end of their presentation. Now let's welcome our 3 panelists. First, Professor Emeritus Dr. Jeffrey Williams. Dr. Williams has been a professor of history at Northern Kentucky University since 1972 and previously served as department chair of history and geography from 2001 to 2009. He was awarded the PhD in history from the University of Edinburgh, Scotland, where he completed a dissertation on 19th century Scottish political history. Dr. Williams will discuss tonight the concept of toxic leaders and how followers can counteract their potential impact. Next, we will hear from Dr. Philip Moberg, an associate professor in the Department of Psychological Science here at NKU. Dr. Moberg earned his PhD in industrial and organizational psychology with minors in social and quantitative psychology from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Moberg's research includes workplace abuse, bullying, and aggression, work motivation, leadership, interpersonal competencies, computer mediated video assessment, testing and measurement, factor analysis, and item response theory. Finally, we welcome Dr. Jonathan Cullick, professor of English and past chair of the English department here at NKU. A former middle school language arts teacher, he supervises student teachers and offers courses in the methods of teaching high school writing and literature. In 2019, the Kentucky Council of Teachers of English named Dr. Cullick College Teacher of the Year. Dr. Cullick's talk tonight will focus on the rhetoric of populism and All the King's Men, Robert Penn Warren's iconic novel on populism's toxic effects in American politics. Please join me in inviting first to the microphone, Dr. Jeffrey Williams.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here back on Northern's campus where I spent the better parts of my professional life. And as an emeritus professor, it's delightful to be back again amongst my former colleagues, students on this lovely summer evening. My role tonight is supposed to cover a lot of territory in a short period of time, the historical perspective on populism, specifically American populism. And I begin by simply saying that everywhere in the world today, populism is alive and well. Everywhere, there are masses of people whose livelihood and whose well-being are at severe risk, who are experiencing intense economic disruption and disturbing social instability. And this really has always been the breeding ground for populism throughout history. In recent decades, globalization and deindustrialization have been enormously disruptive, as we all know, in the lives of millions and millions of people. More recently, the Great Recession and the recent pandemic have thrown further confusion into people's lives, disrupted economic institutions, and created massive stress and anxiety in so many people around the world. For these people at risk, the political systems that they are under are often seen as non-responsive, or worse, partly responsible for the crisis that people are experiencing. The essence of populism is to see the government as run by selfish elites, interested in their own profit, in their own power, and indifferent to the suffering of the common people. Hence, populists are attracted to extraordinary political solutions beyond the normal government that they normally have. They are attracted to charismatic leaders in particular, who articulate their anger, who stoke their resentment, and who promise to restore the economy and the social status of the common people. These leaders are often ready to overthrow normal constitutional restraints, experiment with executive authority beyond anything that people had experienced before in those countries. They're often ready to scapegoat despised minorities, whether that be recently arrived immigrants, racial or ethnic minorities. And they often rely on intense xenophobia, stirring up nationalistic resentment against neighbors and celebrating national greatness at the expense of other countries. And of course, they are ready to attack despised elites, whether that be government elites, whether that be corporate elites, big business, or whether that be cultural elites, like public health officials. Often, this populist vision is extremely nostalgic. It looks to the past with an effort to try to get back to where we were without projecting change in the future. That's what made the phrase "Make America Great Again" so popular, I think, was to refer back to a time when people felt more comfortable, more secure, less anxious. And of course, you could say that all around the world, there are people saying they're going to make Brazil great again, they're going to make Turkey great again, India great again. That's a common theme among so many populists. There are, though, very different approaches with different populists and different solutions. For instance, in Latin America, populism is often associated with left-wing goals. Native population restoring their rights or more socialistic solutions to problems. Whereas in places like Eastern Europe, the emphasis is much more conservative. Places like Poland and Hungary rely on very conservative themes in their populism. And you can see it too in our own country that both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump have been described as populists, even though they come at the problems that America faces from very different perspectives. They are, in a sense, both relying on populistic themes and approaches in their solution to our problems. There's no sort of permanent definition for populism. It's a very loosely defined phrase. It comes from the Latin word populus, meaning people. That doesn't get us very far. And it depends very much on who and how you describe people as to what form of populism we're really talking about. To focus now on American populism, I think it's important to realize what many Americans don't, which is that populism has a very long history in this country. In fact, it's a constant in American life. Some historians, for instance, of populism begin with Thomas Jefferson, the founding father, who had a profoundly influential vision of what American society should be. His ideal American society was one of small farmers, small businessmen, living lives of rough equality in terms of income and political power. This vision, of course, we always have to note, excluded Native Americans, Black Americans, and women. But indeed, it's the most enduring vision for what American society should be, a roughly equal society of individuals enjoying maximum amount of freedom and as divorced from the central government as possible. Jefferson was so wary of the power of government, based, I suppose, on his reaction to the British monarchy and its imposition of control on the colonies. But after the Constitution, he was very sensitive to the idea of the federal government organized by people like Alexander Hamilton and so on, who would encroach on the liberties of the individual, on the states or on the individual. That became such a very powerful theme in his view of American society that it really has long influence over how many Americans see themselves and the role of the government being as minimal as possible. In fact, some historians say it introduced an element of cynicism towards our government that remains constant throughout our American history. Compared to most countries, Americans fear their government. At the same time that they extol its virtues, they also are deeply suspicious of the motivations of politicians and extremely cynical about the way politicians and government tends to encroach on individual liberty. In that sense, there's a very straight line from Jefferson to Ronald Reagan. And I would say even to local politicians today like Rand Paul and Thomas Massey, who share Jefferson's essential deep suspicion that behind every politician is an authoritarian figure who wants to deprive the people of their liberties. So we can say populism has its roots as deeply as our founding father, Thomas Jefferson. It goes on. If I had time, I could talk about Andrew Jackson, who was a populist coming out of the rural Southwest of the then United States, came to Washington to cut back on the power of the federal government at the expense frequently of Native Americans and of course, Black populations. He'd be a fascinating example of an American populist, but I want to concentrate really in the time I have in two great episodes of populist fervor, the first being in the 1890s, the second being in the 1930s. By the 1890s, American society looked completely different from what Thomas Jefferson had hoped it would be. Instead of having a society of roughly equal farmers and small merchants and artisans, the Industrial Revolution had completely disrupted that pattern. And from artisans with handicraft, we'd move to factories. From small businesses, we'd move to corporations, sometimes monopolies of entire industries. That the country was dominated by large corporations and wealthy people who influenced politics in all kinds of ways. At every level of American life, politics, wealth generated what happened, whether that be at the local level with city bosses who were under the control of local business interests, state legislatures. In Ohio, it was the Standard Oil Company. In Kentucky, it was the L&N Railroad that completely dominated state legislatures. And at the national level, the United States Senate was notorious for the bribe takers, senators who were quite open about taking bribes in order to promote the interests of particular businesses. Government, in other words, had run into a pattern which seemed divorced completely from the needs of the teeming masses in the new urban centers, the exploited working class who had no power, as opposed to the wealthy industrialists and politicians who kept that power to themselves. And then in the countryside, you also had turmoil because the Industrial Revolution was transforming agriculture as well. It's a long story, but American farmers had moved from being subsistence farmers to being market-oriented farmers, which meant they were at the mercy of global prices. The prices that they had to increase, they thought would be best done by producing more crops. That resulted in overproduction, a decline in prices. Farmers were facing this incredible crisis of overproduction and declining prices. At the same time that they had to industrialize agriculture in a sense by investing in the kind of products that made farming profitable, such as harvesters, fertilizer, hybrid seeds, and so on. In order to finance those new investments, they became subject to the bank's interest rates. There are wonderful cartoons that the populists produced at that time showing the tentacles of Wall Street reaching out to strangle the throats of independent farmers in the Great Plains as they became completely victimized by huge debts that they accrued in order to maintain their farms. And then, of course, the railroads monopolized transportation in ways that jumped up the prices for freight. And they also had to buy things on the market that was dominated by monopolies and barbed wire and harvesters and so on. The end result being that farming and cities were in crisis by the 1890s. And then just add to that came the Great Depression of the 1890s. The panic of 1893 threw the economy back, millions unemployed. Talk about a crisis. And I'd like to remind Americans that the crisis we're going through now is just one of many that our country has been through. And just as now, just then, people turn to radical solutions for the solution of their problems. I don't have time to go into what resulted with the Populist Party, charismatic leader like William Jennings Bryan, who spoke for the masses and their frustration with their condition. The success of the Populist Party in many locales, local, state, and some cities, but its failure at the national level, that's a story we needn't cover here tonight. But it is an example of how, for a while at least, Americans were prepared to entertain radical notions for how to solve their problems. Ultimately, the Depression ended. The progressive movement restored faith in the American political system by cleaning up politics to a certain extent, and government became more responsive to ordinary people's needs. But once again, in the 1930s, the American economy took a dive. Once again, the malfunction of the economy threw millions out of work, millions out of their home, millions out of their farms, resulting in massive desperation, as you know well, from all we know about the Great Depression. Once again, the existing governments seem to be failing the needs of the people. Think of Herbert Hoover as the embodiment of the federal government's failure to respond adequately to the immense suffering and anxiety of the American people. And enter, I would argue, the most successful populist of all, Franklin Roosevelt, who spoke in very populistic terms when he talked about the plight of the ordinary man, the forgotten American, the working stiff, as opposed to the malefactors of great wealth, as he characterized Wall Street and the bankers. There were competing populists, of course, to Franklin Roosevelt, one of whom Jonathan Cullick will be later talking about in the form of Huey Long, the senator from Louisiana, who took a populist turn on how to redistribute wealth. There was Father Coughlin, the Catholic priest, who blamed the Jews for the Depression. And there were native fascist movements in America, but none of those other alternative populists really got much traction because Franklin Roosevelt was so successful at mobilizing the federal government to begin to satisfy the needs of the people and to provide a safety net, which eventually allayed people's anxieties. And then, of course, the Second World War came along and everybody, changed the subject at that point. But it's just interesting to think of Franklin Roosevelt, although he was a patrician in background, he did adopt many of the populist approaches in attacking the wealthy and the government that had been indifferent to the fate of the majority of Americans. My concluding point in all this is simply to say that populism is as American as apple pie, that there really has never been a time in our history when there weren't some populists out there, whether it be George Wallace or goodness knows who all you can pick as examples. Whenever economic crises create social instability and mass anxiety, and government seems unable to solve the problem, people will seek extraordinary ways of restoring their well-being. Charismatic leaders always emerge to articulate their grievances and promote the restoration of order. So history tells us that Trump was not unique, and given the inevitable recurrence of economic crises, I feel certain in predicting that there will likely be more Trumps in our American future. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Phil Moberg. I am an industrial and organizational psychologist by training, which means I study work. We haven't been able to figure out an effective way to shorten the name of our field in this country. When I was invited to speak tonight, I began looking at the literature on social psychology, in organizational behavior, management, business ethics, and leadership for clues to their treatment of popularism, and discovered that it's only recently been explored in most of those literatures, where the focus has been more traditionally on destructive leadership, dysfunctional leadership, or what we now call toxic leadership. So tonight, what I wanted to do was focus on toxic leadership, and in particular, address the role of followers to answer two questions. How do followers contribute to, that is, facilitate, enable toxic leaders in their emergence? And what can they do about it? So I'm going to talk initially about toxic leadership and then move toward followership, and at the end conclude with some suggestions about what organizations and individual followers might be able to do to counteract the effect of toxic leaders. One of the first things we know about, and pardon me if I wander a bit up here, I'm used to being in a classroom where I tend to wander down aisles and across the front of the room to engage students. But one of the things we know about popularism, as Jeffrey suggested, is that economic instability, economic inequality serves as a primary source. Those perceptions of inequality have a tendency to activate several social psychological processes. They reduce a sense of cohesion among people. That is, we don't see commonly shared values or attitudes or beliefs as much as we might have previously. They also tend to, look at my note here for a second, corrode the sense of social trust that we develop in each other, in our leaders, or in our representatives in organizational settings. So these kinds of social psychological processes tend to evoke responses in us that facilitate the emergence of leaders who have these popularist, or I should say, that would be close enough, toxic tendencies in organizational or social settings. So one of the things that I wanted to look at was the roles of followers in this process. When we look at followership, however, we discover a dearth of research. Our field, that is leadership in particular, has focused for the last almost 100 years on identifying the characteristics of leaders, effective leaders. We've deified leaders. We put them up on a pedestal and said, this person is critical to my organization, all these other people less so. But what anyone in social psychology or leadership in particular can tell you is that this relationship between leaders and followers is very reciprocal. It's a constant negotiation. Think about what you do when you start a new job. You're getting acquainted with your immediate supervisor, manager, vice president, or whomever. And you're actually negotiating how you're going to communicate with each other. You may have a formal role, duties, and responsibilities assigned to you, but there's a negotiation about how you're going to do this and what responsibilities you'll assume and what you need to share with your supervisor and the support and assistance that you'll get. So we look at research on followership and say, well, what are the traditional roles? What do we expect followers to do? And there are things that you would expect. They're expected to get the job done. They're expected to work on behalf of the organization in the organization's best interest. They're expected to support their supervisor, to learn from their supervisor, and even challenge their supervisor when appropriate. So these are the traditional roles that we expect to see from a follower. The issue is that followers exhibit different characteristics that sometimes enable toxic leaders to emerge. That is, they facilitate the process of toxic leader emergence. Some of those characteristics are things like a need for authority, a need to have someone who's making decisions, to alleviate some doubt and concern, some uncertainty held by followers. There's a need for security and safety, a need to feel chosen, to feel part of, a need of belonging to a community. All of these are characteristics of followers that facilitate a toxic leader's emergence. A follower might be fearful of being ostracized, of being kicked out of the community, seen as an out-group member. You may have felt that way at different points in jobs that you've held. The last characteristic is a fear of being powerless. That is unable to change the leader, not having enough individual or collective power to alter the situation. So with that in mind, some research by Padilla in 2007 is absolutely prescient, as I was telling Dr. Cullick before this evening started. He identified characteristics that seem to facilitate the emergence of toxic leaders and proposed a toxic triangle, he called it. This toxic triangle was comprised of a conducive environment, situational characteristics that allow a toxic leader to emerge. It also included characteristics of the leader, him or herself, individual difference variables, we say, but we'll talk about those in a moment. And then characteristics of the follower, And that's where I want to end up. So let's touch on the first two so we can put this in context and then talk about the followers. So one of the characteristics of an organization that allows a toxic leader to emerge is a sense of a lack of checks and balances. Toxic leaders often find themselves in situations where they have a great deal of autonomy. They're not governed by anyone else. They're not checked by another independent unit of the organization. And so they're able to function in an autonomous role. So the lack of checks and balances is an issue. Another characteristic of an organization that can enhance a toxic leader's ability to emerge is the culture of the organization and even the broader culture of the community. So about 20 years ago, a researcher with IBM by the name of Gert Hofstede conducted research within IBM facilities around the world, trying to identify different dimensions of culture. And what he found were 5 big dimensions, 3 of which are relevant here. And these have been related to the emergence of toxic leaders. So we find that cultures which are more collectivistic, that is, which subvert or not subvert, subsume the individual within the collective, that is, tamp down individual efforts to stand out in favor of allegiance to the group as a whole and loyal to the group, that seems to enhance the ability of a toxic leader to emerge. Another of those 3 dimensions is having high power distance. So power distance refers to the privilege and authority and power by someone high up in a society or an organizational setting versus the person at lower levels. We find how high power distance societies in South America, for example, or the Middle East. It's accepted, this power distance. But if you look at Northern Europe, power distance is much smaller. So that's not tolerated. So where there's a high acceptance of power distance, authoritarian or toxic leaders can emerge. The third characteristic, the third dimension of culture is let me put it this way, an avoidance of uncertainty. That is, some cultures don't tolerate ambiguity very well. You could think about a laid-back culture if you like, but a culture that has a low tolerance for ambiguity, wants certainty, wants facts, wants to know everything is under control, is one that seems to allow the emergence of a toxic leader. So if we look at the characteristics then of leaders themselves, we find characteristics like charisma, which can be a characteristic of a positive leader as well, but a charismatic leader usually is gifted rhetorically, is able to energize followers by focusing on conditions that represent threats to the community. But the difference between a positive and negative leader with that kind of charisma is that the positive leader is focused on what we can do to better the social life, if you will, of the community, of the group, of the organization. Whereas the negative charismatic leader is focused on developing their personal power. It's for them, strictly for themselves, and less so for the group that they're a part of. Another characteristic of the leader that we need to think about is this notion of personalized power strictly for the leader's own benefit. That is, the leader may try to convey that what they're doing is for the benefit of their broader community, that is their followers, and it may indeed be, but it's not socialized power. Socialized power is power granted to a leader by virtue of the organization's norms, practices, and policies. Socialized power is the power granted to the leader of this university by the university and its board of regents. Personalized power is power assumed that's the word I'm looking for. Let's just stick with assumed by the leader for his or her personal benefit. And so that kind of power is appealing to people who are longing for some sense of security, some sense of safety, some sense of authority. Other characteristics associated with leadership have included things like narcissism, sense of self-aggrandizement and privilege, a negative life theme. Some research has shown leaders who are toxic have emerged from younger lives that were abusive or where there was criminality in the home, or even psychiatric disorders in the home, perhaps with parents. So I'm citing here examples of characteristics associated with toxic leadership. Another characteristic tends to be a theme of trying to dominate others, a theme that basically captures hatred. So one of the things that we're trying to understand is how A, followers enable these kinds of leaders to emerge, and B, what we can do about them. So Padilla identified two groups of followers. One he referred to as colluders and the other conformers. Conformers you might think of as more passive. They're people who lack a sense of identity, lack self-esteem, sense of self-efficacy. They're vulnerable to influence attempts. Whereas colluders are your instrumental friends who may be willing to follow an unethical leader, a toxic leader, because there's something in it for them. That is, there's a potential gain of prestige, of power themselves, of promotion, of financial gain, association with the leader. So these are just two characterizations, rather, of following groups who may support the emergence of a toxic leader. So what I'll leave you with is some guidance from a book. It's a theoretical piece. It's not really based on good empirical science, which I would prefer, from Challeff, C-H-A-L-E-F-F, called The Courageous Follower. What Challeff argues is that there are 5 dimensions that we should build or encourage in followers that all involve courage. So the courage to serve, to work hard, to stand up for the leader, okay, and to assume responsibility when it's provided. The courage to challenge, that is, to voice discomfort with decisions perhaps that have been made, to speak up, to stand out. The courage to participate in transformation, that is, when organizational change occurs, and it does at universities with regularity, it involves different sets of emotions, and we need to manage that. The fourth is the courage to take moral action. So when a leader makes a decision that is unethical, it's the willingness to stand up and say no, or at least raise it to someone who may be in a position to counteract that leader. And the last is the courage to speak to hierarchy. That is, to provide information to leaders from the follower's position on the front lines, if you will, to make sure that the leader's making an informed decision. So I have a good deal more information, but I will stop there. Thanks.
Good evening. I have some slides to show you so I can put some text in front of you. So if you're online, you might want to expand that portion of your screen so you can look at the slides. I gave my talk a little title, "He Could Talk So Good." This quotation comes from the political novel, All the King's Men. I'm here this evening because I have studied populism by way of American literature for many years, specifically through this great political novel, All the King's Men, written by Robert Penn Warren. This line, "He could talk so good," is spoken by one of the followers. It's very much a novel about the rise of a populist and about the followers, as Phil was just talking about. I think you will see all the different kinds of followers in that novel. The political rhetoric in this novel positions it as a historical case study in American populism and demagoguery. It's based upon the life and career of US Senator Huey Long and governor of the state of Louisiana in the 1920s and 30s. This line, "He could talk so good," gets to how much populism is about talk. Any definition of populism must include its rhetorical characteristics, because we know that a political actor is populist through the way they talk. Populism may or may not be enacted in an elected politician's policy proposals, but it is always enacted in language, and that language is flexible enough to course its way from the political left to the political right. Populism is performed in language. As Jeffrey was talking about the history of populism as an actual political movement, that history as a movement, as a political party, was quite limited, but as a style of speech, it has a very, very broad history. In his classic study of populism, Michael Kazin defines populism not as an ideology, but as, quote, "a language of mass discontent." The sociolinguist Jeffrey Nunberg defines populism as, quote, "as much a matter of style as substance," and he continues, "whoever's deploying it, the language of populism always involves a direct appeal to the emotions." National Review writer Michael Brendan Doherty defines populism as, quote, "a political style that locates the legitimacy of political action and reform in ordinary people directed primarily against what it sees as elite groups or corrupted elite institutions." Writers from left to right, David Brooks, George Will, Ross Douthat, and on, talk about populism as a style of speech. So let's talk about the style of language. There we go. Whether it is on the left or the right of the political spectrum, populism always performs a key rhetorical maneuver. And this kind of continues from what Jeffrey was just talking about. It draws a line between those perceived to be regular or real people and those considered to be the elite. The people are represented as authentic, practical, the producers of society, usually small town or rural, and powerless. We hear the terminology: soccer mom, hockey mom, the average Joe, Joe the plumber, Joe's six-pack, real America, real people. Here's a quotation briefly from Sarah Palin, quote, "We believe that the best of America is not all in Washington, D.C. We believe the best of America is in these small towns that we get to visit and these wonderful little pockets of what I call the real America. Being here with all you hardworking, very patriotic, very pro-America areas of this great nation." And so the quotation goes on, you get the point. The elite are represented as artificial, intellectual, condescending, cosmopolitan, and certainly powerful. As Jeffrey was saying, they range from financial to cultural. You hear the language, references to Wall Street bankers, Chardonnay sipping, latte drinking, the cocktail party set. I think Josh Mandel just used that kind of the cocktail party image recently. When Elizabeth Warren was running for senator in Massachusetts against Scott Brown, very frequently in debates, he would be sure to refer to her with emphasis as professor. So this is the cover of Michael Kazin's classic study on populism, The Populist Persuasion. It's a history, but it is very much also a history of language. And as you can see, the silhouettes of Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump demonstrate kind of the range of populism, as Jeffrey was saying. Kazin notes two styles of populism. He calls them civic nationalism and ethnic racial nationalism. We could say there's economic populism expressed as opposition to a financial elite, and a more nationalistic populism expressed as opposition to immigration and a cultural elite. So let's talk about what the key rhetoric elements of all this rhetoric are. An elevated speaker who attacks elites and experts, shares the grievances of a powerless audience, appeals to their values, promises to be their insider agent, and deploys combative language, usually in the form of slogans. We see this kind of thing actually in the novel All the King's Men. Our populist leader who rises to power in that novel starts out, as he says, as a hick who self-educates, goes to law school, becomes a lawyer, throws away, literally on stage, throws away the speeches written for him by those elitist political aides of his, and he talks to his audience and tells them, you're all just a bunch of hicks and so am I. He promises that he is going to go to that state capitol and he's going to swing that meat axe against the elites. That is, he's going to be their voice, and he leads his audiences in chants of nail him up, nail him up. He's going to go to the state capitol and nail him up. All right, well, let's talk about some contemporary tie-ins. Well, we have time for one. Okay. Some interesting parallels actually between Donald Trump's style and some of the rhetorical maneuvers that you see actually in the novel All the King's Men, including an actual speech where Donald Trump had this piece of paper with a speech on it and threw it away. So I'm not going to read that. Literally right out of the novel All the King's Men. I'm going to focus in particular on his acceptance speech for the nomination at the 2016 Republican National Convention. Donald Trump followed the formula that I just showed you on the previous slide. I'm going to show you a passage of the speech. Now, the speech became famous for a couple of lines where he said, I alone can fix it. But let's put that line into context. It's actually a very well-written speech. Let's take a look. Every day I wake up, and I'm just excerpting, every day I wake up determined to deliver a better life for the people all across this nation that have been neglected, ignored, and abandoned. I have visited the laid-off factory workers. These are the forgotten men and women of our country. These are people who work hard but no longer have a voice. I am your voice. I have joined the political arena so that the powerful can no longer beat up on people that cannot defend themselves. Nobody knows the system better than me, which is why I alone can fix it. Now we put that line into context. By the way, just notice something about some of these lines up here and other lines of the speech. They could just as easily have been spoken by Bernie Sanders. Just notice that. The identification with the factory workers and the ordinary people. So you can see a lot going on here in those rhetorical elements. We have an elevated speaker, elevated in terms of money, visibility, and political connections. He attacks elites and experts. He shares the grievances of his powerless audience. He promises to be their voice, their agent, appeals to their values, and of course, in his rallies, I don't think it was at this convention, I'm not sure, but in the rallies, we hear the same kind of nail them up sort of chants that come right out of All the King's Men. Build the wall, lock her up, send them back, stop the steal. Well, I want to conclude with a reference to what Phil Moberg was talking about a few minutes ago. Phil was talking about the toxic leader, but then the positive leader. I don't want to leave the impression that appeals to ordinary people are necessarily toxic. Of course, they're not. In the novel, All the King's Men, Willie Stark starts out giving the most boring, tedious speeches talking about tax policy and data and statistics and so forth. And it takes a journalist, a reporter who's going to become his top political aide, who tells him, stop this. You're boring people. These are horrible speeches. And he says probably a very famous line out of the novel. For God's sake, don't try to improve their minds. Just make them feel something, make them feel alive. Well, good politicians and political leaders will, especially at moments of tragedy, seek to unify. I'm thinking in particular of a speech that gets anthologized a lot and actually used in college writing courses. It's Ronald Reagan's speech after the Challenger explosion. Actually, beautifully written, beautifully delivered speech, appealing to values of perseverance and respect for valor and sacrifice. George W. Bush's speech at the 9/11 memorial service just a few days after, the speech includes just a long series of references to all of just the ordinary people, the Americans who just went to work that day and never saw their loved ones again. Oh, beautifully written speech. I'm thinking of Obama's speech at the Charlottesville memorial service, where he began singing Amazing Grace and led the audience in the singing of Amazing Grace. These speeches, which I highly recommend, they're all on YouTube, and you can check them out. They all show examples of appeals to ordinary people and their values, seeking hope and unity, appealing to reason about and arousing our better angels. But of course, as I say here, what we think of as populist language, the toxic leader that Phil was talking about, tends to use that language to instill fear, foster division, to distract, and to stir rage. But it can be used for a popular purpose. So depends on the leader, depends on the followers. Thank you all so much. Advance to the next.
All right, at this point, I'd like to invite our speakers to the front for some dialogue and questions. I do see that we have one in the Q&A from our virtual audience, and I'm also going to invite those here in the room to raise your hand if you have questions as well. Our first question comes from one of our virtual attendees named Robert, and he asks the following. I'm intrigued to hear your take on the role or not of political ideology among populists. Is ideology simply fluid in populism?
I'm sorry, can you hear me? Good. Okay, so the question was the role of ideology in populism?
Yes. Is ideology fluid in populism, or does it somehow connect to populism?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, yes, it's fluid. In fact, I think Jeffrey, you were in your talk, you were talking about a variety of different elected individuals kind of running the gamut, ideologically. That was something I noticed as you were doing your historical survey.
And Mike or Stephen Kazin that you quoted from said exactly the same thing, that it really isn't an ideology, but rather a sort of set of attitudes that vary by the individual. So I don't know quite what the person is looking for, but I think would be hard for anybody to find one populist ideology that all populists agreed with.
In fact, in the beginning of Michael Kazin's book, he says that it's impossible to write the manifesto of populism. That, in fact, Jeffrey Moberg talks about that, how a politician will be known for their platform as a Republican or their platform as a Democrat, but you don't, and of course voters as well, but you don't hear people identifying and saying, yeah, I'm a populist. So it's more of a fluid style.
Great. How about for folks in the room? Do we have any questions here in our live audience? I'm going to give you all the chance to ask questions if you have them. All right, seeing none, we do have another question online. This question comes from Chris and is specifically directed to Dr. Cullick, although I think others might want to weigh in as well. Chris enjoyed your comments, Dr. Cullick, about not only Donald Trump using populist rhetoric, but also Bernie Sanders. And Chris wants to know if you see many younger politicians doing the same thing, or how about female politicians? Are there any populist examples of female politicians?
Oh, okay. Well, there are so many in the news right now. You know, you hear politicians from, well, I mentioned Josh Mandel. So there's a young politician, or, you know, Matt Gaetz, Marjorie Taylor Greene, others whose names I can't remember, but it seems that actually AOC would be another one who occasionally uses. So if we're kind of looking at the whole political spectrum, Elizabeth Warren actually is another one. So yeah, I mean, you know, so much political speech now takes place in a virtual environment on Twitter, and we see sometimes daily or at least weekly kind of, you know, examples of, you know, people using populist rhetoric in one way or another.
I would agree that you could take somebody who's a feminist, who speaks in populist terms about women's needs and aspirations, and contrast that or compare it with Phyllis Schlafly and the sort of conservative women's movement, who also celebrate the common woman and the conservative values of traditional American society that are being corrupted or threatened by elites who are trying to come in and break down the family and blah, blah, blah. I mean, it seems to me that these populist themes keep coming back no matter what side of the spectrum we're on, amongst women and men.
Mm-hmm.
Great. I see that we have a question here in the room.
Well, I think that's the answer. Box. Is it working? Let me ask the reverse question. Given how pervasive populist rhetoric is, particularly in American political life, are there examples of politicians who don't use populist rhetoric?
I think some of the more doctrinaire New Left people in the 1960s got caught up in theoretical ideas that were divorced from the reality of ordinary people's lives. I think the conservative movement in the 1940s and 50s was dealing with doctrinaire issues and their anti-communism and so on that didn't appeal directly to people. The more sort of theoretical a political speech is, the less likely it is to be populist. And I think most politicians realize that those were dead ends, and that utilizing populist memes and themes is a much more compelling way to attract popular interest. So the few who ignored that did so at their peril, politically speaking, I think.
I also saw another hand in the room.
So this question, I guess, is directed towards all three of you. When talking in with people, like especially like us as college students and people who just know of kind of what populism is about, there's always a weird connotation with populism and Nazism. And so people would assume that populism would go with, you know, Adolf Hitler speaking in the Triumph of the Wills 1935 speech of, I'm just like you, you know, like I worked with you and all of that. What would you say to someone who has that dangerous connotation that that populism is kind of involved with Nazism, when, you know, Bernie Sanders would kind of be on the far extreme left side of everything and be way away from Nazism? What would your response be to someone who says, well, no, populism is a de facto form, I guess you could say, of Nazist speech and Nazist rhetoric?
Nazism is a classic example of populism. If you think of Hitler in terms of things that we've been saying here tonight, the rhetoric and the scapegoating of Jews, the nationalism, the contempt for the democratic process, the idea that a charismatic leader can solve all problems, restoring Germany to its greatness. I mean, it's textbook. And that's the most dangerous version of populism that we saw in the 20th century. Unfortunately, we have our new versions now in the 21st century, of course. Do you want to add to that?
When we're talking about rhetoric that's intended to appeal to all people, broadly, we're talking about a lot of ways in which the rhetoric can be used, and you just hear a lot of politicians in some way or another employ language that's intended to appeal to the values of their audience. So this is why this goes back to what Phil was saying about how leaders, there can be positive leaders certainly, who will use language in order to unify, and it's a benign usage, of speech that I guess we could call populism. It's just that the term itself has taken on, such a connotation of a toxicity, I guess.
The next question comes from my friend Susie, who is watching virtually. She asks this: along with the movements that I associate with populism, we are also in the midst of a movement to challenge the structures that have perpetrated racial inequalities. Is this movement towards significant social change historically typical?
Is it what?
Historically typical.
Can you repeat that question?
Sure. Susie is saying that in addition to this populist moment in time, we are also in the midst of a movement to change the social structures that have perpetrated racial inequality. And she wants to know if this change towards attacking social inequality combined with populism is historically typical or atypical.
When you were speaking, Jeffrey, you were talking about how often what we call populism excludes so many people, and it becomes just so narrowly defined racially, right, and in other ways.
Exactly. I think if you look back at the history of American populism, there are very, very few populists who tried to reach across the racial divide. And unfortunately, too many of them have relied on the racial divide as part of their appeal. I think, though, you can say that people like Jesse Jackson and Martin Luther King expressed in what they advocated the idea that ordinary Black people should be part of the mainstream of American society, and that you can say, in a sense, that they were trying to elevate the forgotten people of color in a way that is populist. But unfortunately, the majority of the populist parties and movements that I'm familiar with in American history were primarily white and frequently relied on discrimination against people of color, recently arrived immigrants, religious minorities, as part of their sort of restoration of the American way, the pure white American way. So racism has tainted populism throughout much of its history. So I'm afraid the person who asking that question is probably not going to be happy to know that there's not a lot of likelihood that somehow populism can coordinate with the attempts to demolish or diminish racism in this country, at least based on historical experience.
Next question, and I think, Phil, this may be one that you could weigh in on. A virtual audience member wants to know if there's any overlap between populism and the creation of cults of personality.
Okay, so I'm going to have to admit that the cult of personality is not an area that we examine closely in industrial and organizational psychology. That sounds closer to political science to me. I would think, based on research in toxic leadership, that the toxic leader, the destructive or dysfunctional leader that emerges, often exhibits traits that lead followers, especially those that are more passive. The conformers, and particularly the colluders, those who are attached to the leader by virtue of instrumental goals that they can achieve through that association, that would probably represent a cult of personality.
Any questions in the room? Yes, thank you.
So I'm wondering, given that populism is about language, what is the role of the medium of communication, whether it be AM radio with Father Coughlin or social media today? Is it just serving as a multiplier of followers, a stronger megaphone, or do you think it could be fundamentally changing the nature of populism, social media?
It's a characteristic of populists to be highly critical of the media, but also very skilled at manipulating it. Donald Trump was not the first populist to denounce journalists, although I think what they do is they lump together the major news media as part of this elite group who are ignoring the needs of ordinary people. But at the same time, they've become extremely effective in recent times at utilizing social networks, communicating and going far beyond just the traditional stump speeching and newspaper writing to involve masses of people who are utilizing these new forms of media. So I would say that it's had a hugely important role in what populists do now, not just in America, but in all countries.
We have an audience member asking about the difference between populism and humanism. This audience member says populism seems to be the language of humanism, and in recent years, the line seems to be blurred. Can any of you address this?
Aligned with what?
The line between populism and humanism.
I would guess that humanism puts an emphasis on the individual and populism puts an emphasis on the group, and are essentially coming at the human condition from very different perspectives. Humanistic values seem to be those that relate to an individual and their moral values, whereas populism seems to be more of a national culture or a social norm rather than an exploration of individual humanistic values. But that's just a off the top of my head response. Gentlemen?
I see we have another question here in the room.
So given the American society, and this may tie Jennifer into the conversation, you know, with freedom of speech, does the American is there an American version of populism that's a little more something because we're so free with our speech?
Can you explain that just a little?
Well, I don't know that I can. You know, you mentioned, you know, Hitler, and I mean, there's other examples in other countries, but given our freedom of speech and just anybody can say anything and do all sorts of things, does that, I don't know, create I don't know, do we have a kind of an American version of populism, or is populism just worldwide?
Since I've been invited into the
Yes, please.
conversation, I'll take the bait. So from a comparative perspective, our First Amendment is a lot more expansive and protective, particularly in the political arena. I mean, that's kind of our gold standard in terms of the free speech that our Constitution protects. I appreciate the theory that you're positing, which is that perhaps that creates some breeding ground, piggybacking off of the wonderful presentations that we've heard tonight about how language is the cornerstone of populism. And so if our Constitution is protecting in a heightened way all sorts of language that might lead to a stronger populist movement, I mean, I can definitely see where you're headed with that. Compared to our European counterparts, we are allowed to say a lot more, and our politicians are allowed to say a lot more. Does that mean that we are a breeding ground for populist leaders? Maybe so.
Thank you for saying it better than I did.
We have a question at home. Can any successful politician not be populist to a certain extent?
That's a great question, because I think that every politician to be successful has to make people feel that they're part of something larger than themselves. They have to do something that appeals to the emotions, and that's not actually in itself a bad thing, because people can not only be reasoned into action. I mean, we're all emotional creatures. We need to be moved into action through the way we feel. I'd mentioned earlier in my talk this pivotal scene from All the King's Men, where Jack Burton, the journalist turning political aide, says to Willie Stark, for sweet Jesus' sake, don't try to improve their minds. Just make them feel something. They don't feel anything. Make them feel something. And there are two ways to look at that kind of advice. You could look at that and you could say, oh my gosh, that is so insulting to the voters, and it's so condescending, and I guess it is. But it's also true. It's accurate. I mean, the advice that Jack Burton gives to Willie Stark, the politician, that advice works. And you asked Kevin a moment ago about the medium, right? In the media, what effect that has. Well, we're living in a period of 128 characters now. Is that, I think, what we're at with Twitter? And a politician who knows how to use that 28 character space, that little window, knows how to use it well, they're going to achieve something. There's a difference between that little space on the screen and a 200 or 300 page book published with a university press exploring a particular economic issue or issue related to education or healthcare. And it's that 128 characters that can strike at the emotions very quickly, and then to unpack that quick hit kind of statement, it takes a lot more language, which is to say a lot less effective language from a politician, right? I mean, so that's kind of the quandary that we're in, the conundrum, I guess.
This next question, I think, cuts at something very deep in terms of American democracy today. How important is truth-telling to populism?
Oh, goodness
Speaking of
me.
128 characters on Twitter, yeah.
I mean, I don't think populism is unique as a political movement in needing to persuade people, often at the cost of truth. I mean, who was the last politician who told us nothing but the truth? I don't think we'd remember them because they never got elected, I suspect. I just think that's a standard which, you know, it's just hard to imagine politicians being able to get elected and be successful unless they manipulate the truth in ways that become persuasive for their audiences. And it's not a conscious thing, maybe many times, that they engage in falsehood, but the manipulation of truth in ways that favor their cause is an inevitable aspect of being a politician, it seems to me.
A question here in the room.
Question to everybody, but I'll start, Phil Moberg, I kind of start by addressing, you gave us a recipe for followers to remove ourselves as toxic followers, but suppose I was going to run for president and I wanted to reset the table in the United States. What advice would you give a leader trying to turn away from toxic leadership, which I guess I could ask the question, same thing in a business culture, a workplace, if you inherited a toxic workplace and you had to turn things around. And I remember Jonathan's slide, for example, the way of counterpoint of hope and fear, and the toxic leader says fear, maybe the antidote to that is to talk about hope. But I wondered from the standpoint of your scholarship, what advice would you give such a candidate?
Well, if I put on my consultant's hat and an organization approaches me with a toxic leadership problem, I would probably sit down with them and look at what they're doing in the selection of their leaders. Now, when organizations typically hire someone at the top, there's no assessment of psychopathy, of mental stability. There's no assessment of personality traits. There's no assessment of whether they're self-aggrandizing narcissists. There is no assessment. So leaders are selected based on appearances, based on opinions, based on prior experiences, relevance to the issues confronting an organization. So what an organization needs to do, I think, and some of the research I've been reading recently suggests this, is a better job of developing leaders before they reach that highest level of an organization. In other words, identify the characteristics, the traits, the behaviors, the skill sets, the competencies that are valued in that organization, and begin rewarding leaders for doing so. And when behaviors are dysfunctional and destructive and counterproductive, demand remediation. That is, require that a leader go through a process to modify those behaviors that have been found to be dysfunctional and undesirable. So we don't do a very good job beyond the, I'd say, the mid-level management world of selecting people and of assessing them carefully. We do that at the lower level. We do massive amounts of assessment of entry-level employees and entry-level supervisors and mid-level managers. We assess lots of different things. We put them through a set of exercises that can sometimes take a week, called an assessment center, where they have to behaviorally demonstrate what they would do in different circumstances. We administer countless kinds of assessments of cognitive skills and abilities, of personality traits, of attitudes. We could assess some of the characteristics of followers, for example, self-esteem, self-efficacy, some of the characteristics that are problematic that lead to the emergence of toxic leaders, and then train. I can train someone to become more self-efficacious, train them to develop a stronger sense of self-esteem. You can train them to be less anxious, to take more control over their circumstances. So there are interventions that an organizational psychologist could engage in to try to modify the sequence of events that leads people to the point where they become a toxic leader that's a threat to an organization or a society or some sort of a group. But we often don't talk about that. We talk about the populist leader or the toxic or destructive leader once they emerge and cause problems. We don't go backward into the sequence and ask the question, how did they get here? And where could we have intervened to head this off? So it's a much more complex, lengthy process than typically I think we consider when we're looking at problematic, toxic leaders.
All right, this is the last question, and it's a big one, so I want to leave time for all of you to weigh in. This same question was actually asked by two of our virtual attendees. Is populism a threat to American democracy? Why or why not?
I think that the only way I can answer that is to say that it depends on which populist you're talking about. I think when you think back historically, Franklin Roosevelt saved this country from itself, from an economic system that had thrown the country into catastrophe. But at the same time, there were populists who were advocating fascism. There were populists who were turning the attention of the public against particular groups and making them responsible for the Depression. There was every kind of populist going in the 1930s, as there is, I think, now, a great range. So I shy away from the idea that you can say that definitely populism is good or bad for the country, which was sort of the point of the question, correct? It depends on which populist you're talking about.
I think when we talk about toxic leaders, the distinction between a leader who is not toxic, who is positive, and those who are maybe toxic and destructive involves their end goal. So the toxic, destructive, dysfunctional leaders, and this may be some populists, are focused on what benefits them personally, and less, much less on what benefits the group, the society, the organization that they're a part of. So it seems to me earlier when we had the humanism, populism question, it strikes me as humanism generally has a positive tone to it. And a concern for others and for the social group. And I'm not sure always that populism does, though I think a populist like Franklin Roosevelt certainly did have society in general at different levels and different pieces as a foremost concern. So there's a positive populist, where his counterpart in Germany at the same time was certainly a negative populist.
Dr. Cullick, would you like to weigh in?
I'm glad that Jeffrey responded first, because I think that's an excellent answer, that it depends on what you mean by populism. It depends on the kind of populism. I think that Michael Kazin, we've talked about him a little this evening. I think that he makes a good point in saying that there's a kind of populism right now that has been ascendant internationally and in the United States. And it is a populism that is anti-immigrant, and it is very much expressed in racial terms. And I think that that is very damaging, very dangerous expression of populism. Someone asked the question about truth. Well, when populism, I think with some deliberation, decides to reject truth. That's a dangerous kind of populism. So those are kind of currents that I'm concerned about.
Well, please join me in thanking our three panelists, Dr. Williams, Dr. Cullick, and Dr. Moberg. It's been a wonderful evening dialoguing with you. Please join me in expressing our gratitude. As a reminder, the 6 at 6 series will continue in the spring. We'd also like to invite you back, for those of you interested in politics, on November 2nd at 6:30 for the Forum on Legislative Redistricting here at NKU. The information is on the screen and available to you at home as well. Thank you again for being with us tonight. Have a wonderful evening.